Hello, my name is Brenda Bailey-Hughes, and I welcome you to Cyber Focus, where today we'll be exploring and maybe challenging some commonly held beliefs about entrepreneurship. Is it always good for an economy? Does it promote innovation and employment? Are there certain barriers to startups? Our guest today has conducted extensive research in this area, and her work, it might surprise you. Please meet Sameeksha Desai. She's an assistant professor in the IU School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and she's the associate director of the Institute for Development Strategies. Sammy, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having
Appreciate
me.
you coming in. Well, just start generally. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your research interests and why studying entrepreneurship is so important right now.
So my interest is really in the relationship between entrepreneurship, economic development, and political stability.
Okay.
And so entrepreneurship is really important because, first of all, it happens everywhere. Entrepreneurship is a consistent thread. And we see more and more that people view self-employment in one way, or starting a business in another way, and then starting and growing a business as a way to support themselves, support their families, and create wealth. And that occurs across countries.
Okay.
And so you see, for example, in a lot of countries that entrepreneurship is something that people do in order to avoid unemployment. In a lot of other places, entrepreneurship is something people do to capitalize on an opportunity for profit. Sometimes it's a combination of both things.
Right.
But entrepreneurship is really sort of just a sweeping, incredibly important and pervasive activity. So we have to study it.
And you said you study particularly the connection between entrepreneurship and political stability?
Yeah, entrepreneurship, economic development, and political stability.
Okay. Speak to the political stability and development piece.
So, so one of the things that is really interesting about political stability and development is that they are increasingly, I think, being acknowledged as inseparable. And so it's not a coincidence, for example, that most countries that host recurring periods of conflict, or most countries that are unstable, are also poor.
For example?
Well, so there's, and when I say poor, I mean structurally poor, right?
Okay.
So for example, if you look at distribution systems, so even if you look at a place like Iraq, which is somewhat different than sort of modern civil wars, but even if you look at a place like Iraq, while Iraq is rich because of its oil wealth, you see that distribution systems and the allocation of revenues and benefits from oil production have not been equitable.
Okay.
And so that's what I mean by structurally poor. You see the same thing, for example, in a place like Nigeria. You see the same thing in Sudan. You've seen it, in Liberia, Somalia. You've seen it in almost every place where you see conflict, whether it's sort of internal civil conflict or a cross-border type of dispute. You do see that there are resources over which people fight, and that, at least one of the major contributing factors is the allocation of resources or benefits from exploitation of resources is not equitable. And then, and that's something that is really getting a lot more focus now.
Why?
Because I think the understanding of the importance of distribution and of this relationship between development and stability is something that, because of the way the world is right now, has really been drawn to the forefront of people's attention. And so in the past, there has been a lot of focus, and there still is, and rightfully so, but there's been a lot of focus on things like the social causes of conflict. So are conflicts religious? Are they sort of, caused or spurred by ethnic divides? And are they race related? And you do see in many of these places there are religious, social, and other cleavages, but again, they tend to be poor. If there is something to fight over, and if there is inefficient or sort of inequitable distribution of resources, then people form alliances and start to fight. And then those alliances, they're social or religious or ethnic or racially based. And so that's really important, I think. And that is, at least in part, and I think to a large extent, driven by the relationship between the development and political stability contexts of the country.
And so, Sammy, I know that you co-authored a paper fairly recently about the different ways to measure some of these things we've been talking about: political instability, environmental factors, and entrepreneurship. Can you tell us a little bit more about that research, and particularly the two different data sets that you were looking at?
Right. So entrepreneurship is it's everywhere, right?
Right.
And it's fascinating. And the problem with it is it's so difficult to capture. And the reason that is because there's so many different types of entrepreneurial activity that take place. And so, for example, you have entrepreneurs that are engaged in illegal activity. You have entrepreneurs that are engaged in legal activity. Then you have entrepreneurs that are registered by whatever official government registration agency exists. And then you have unregistered entrepreneurs, which can be, depending on the country, but in many developing countries, a substantial proportion of business activities. And then you also have entrepreneurs that are starting new companies as separate registered firms. And, for example, for every real estate project or for every development, you create a separate firm, but it's owned by the same person. When you trace back the owner. And so there's many different types of entrepreneurship. And so the challenge for research is really trying to capture what you're looking at. So, for example, some data sets will look at formal entrepreneurship, and that is, for example, the official rate of entry in a country. And other data sets will look at what you would call nascent entrepreneurship, which is the intention or, being in the process of starting a business. And, one criticism that might draw from a policy perspective is that we don't know if those people actually start businesses, right? And then the criticism that data that looks at the official rate of entry would receive is we don't know if that actually captures the full range of people starting businesses.
So one may be overestimating and the other may be underestimating.
Right,
so
right.
From a policy perspective, or even just basing decisions, business decisions on those, how do I know which tool to use?
Well, I mean, you have to sort of first ask the question, what are you looking at? So if you're looking at innovation, for example, then you probably want to look at something like patents. And that's an entirely different data set. And that is something that in the United States would be a very reliable source of reporting on innovation activities.
Is it reliable
innovation
elsewhere?
Outcomes. It would depend on the country context. So if you're in a country where there isn't a strong sort of protection tradition or structure, then you couldn't really use that data to look at activities that were going on. If you're also
protection of intellectual property,
intellectual property, right? If you are also, for example, in a country where many people are engaged in entrepreneurship in order to avoid unemployment, right? So they're really self-employed, which you might call necessity entrepreneurship. Then innovation data might not capture what you're studying. And then, there's a couple of data sets and sort of data collection efforts that attempt to standardize the questions or standardize what's being examined so that you can compare it across countries. So you can say, look, is China better than India? Is the United States better than Sweden? And, the one that is used probably the most often is the doing business data set, which is run out of the World Bank.
Okay.
And that data set looks at a number of factors that affect the ability of people to do business. And so, for example, contractual enforcement, right? So how well can people expect their contracts to be upheld, right? Or, to what extent can you expect protection of private property? And so
is this one that measures how difficult it is to open a business?
To open a business,
okay,
yeah. And so this also measures, for example, the number of procedures that you need to do, which, depending on, again, where you are, maybe 6, maybe 2, maybe none if you're not registered. And so some countries will require, for example, that you operate, or that you first register your business at the county level or at the state level. And there's a state agency that will make sure, for example, that nobody already has the name of your business. And then you register it at the government level, at the state level. And then you pay environmental licensing fees. And then you get your health code, depending on what kind of business you have. But then you get your health code certificate. Then you do all of your other sort of regulatory burden activities. And the reason that you would want a cross-country data set like the Doing Business data set or the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor or the World Bank Group's Entrepreneurship Survey, which is different from Doing Business and measures the rate of new businesses that are formed. The reason you would want something like that is because you really want to be able to say, how good are these countries doing?
Sure.
And how good are they compared to each other? And then when you find a country that's performing exceptionally well or one that's performing exceptionally poorly, you should be able to isolate certain factors. I mean, it's not a coincidence, for example, that in general, many countries that are extremely poor and also politically unstable, but even those that are stable, perform poorly on the Doing Business index and don't have strong protection of private property, don't have good contractual enforcement. One of the things that is really important for capital, for example, for capital to reach businesses where it's needed, is protection of minority investors. And again, those same countries don't perform well in that context. And so there really is a benefit to using cross-country data sets. But, there are obviously things that they can't measure. And we have to be aware of that, because if you want to look at a country like Nigeria, or you want to look at Somalia, the official data sets are not going to tell you the whole story.
We started with some conversation around you named off several countries that had experienced that, what would you call the Libyas of the world and
the ongoing political instability.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and again,
and you've actually worked in some areas that would be considered conflict zones.
That right. So there's actually also a spectrum of political instability, right? And so there are internal conflicts, there are civil wars, there are conflicts where you have cross-border activity going on. In the past, you would see wars between countries, and now you see a lot of conflicts within countries. And you see that particularly in the post-colonial states, because there were, in many cases, arbitrary divisions, and then groups of people would be separated. Natural transportation networks would be separated, and that all sort of feeds into conflict. So there's a range of political instability as well. Some people, for example, consider Mexico extremely unstable, but it's not, but it is very different than what's happening in Sudan and what happened, for example, in the former Yugoslavia. And so these are all different types of conflict.
So your experience in that realm of the world, can you speak to that and how you got involved in that kind of work?
So I've always been interested in, again, the relationship between entrepreneurship, economic development, and political instability. And specifically, two questions. The first is, what are the incentives that drive entrepreneurs to behave in the way that they do?
Okay.
And
isn't it obvious? Money or production or innovation? I mean, is it not obvious?
Well, it can be. When I say incentives, I mean more, what actually makes them do the activity that they choose. So, for example, if I know that I can expect the government to claim 80% of my revenues, then I'm probably not going to register my firm.
Okay.
Right? But I might still engage in the activity.
Okay. So incentives for more specific behaviors than being an entrepreneur.
Right.
Specific behaviors within it. Thank you.
But, also for being an entrepreneur. So in some states, so for example, in Iraq, in Iraq's sort of recent history, not lately, but the attractiveness of government employment versus the danger of private sector employment in terms of expectation of the government trying to take part of your revenues, or in terms of uncertainty. Lack of access to transportation networks, capital, that type of thing. Really, a lot of those things can incentivize public sector work. Okay. So then you have people that could be innovative, that could be owning businesses and doing things efficiently, seeking other types of employment. So, and ideally, you want great people in both. And so the underlying question for me is, why do people do the things that they do? And the problem is, we don't actually know what they do in a lot of cases. So we don't actually know to what extent people are engaged in productive activity. We don't know to what extent they're engaged in destructive activity. So much of the work that needs to be done and that is being done is basically about understanding what's actually happening, and then trying to figure out what affects it, what drives it. And then the third step is designing policy, which is really your end goal. And so, for example, and then the other question, I think I mentioned two questions. And then the other question that I look at is, how can policies create incentives and to bring people into the productive, legitimate sector? And that addresses two things. The first is, for people that are already engaged in private sector activity, how do we bring them into the light? If the light is the sort of publicly acknowledged, registered, official sector, how do we do that? Because that's good for everybody. And then the second thing is, for people that are engaged in private sector activity that's not productive. So, and that includes things like, selling electricity off the grid, or extortion, or running drugs. These are all profitable private sector activities. What policies can create incentives to bring them into productive sector employment? Because one of the things we forget is, in a lot of politically unstable economies, private sector work is very profitable. It's just also very difficult. So the few that are extremely successful often end up doing things that are not productive. And there's big money to keep that going. There's big money and power to keep that going. And so it's not always the money aspect, but there are other goals and incentives that you would hope that policy can sort of bring to the forefront. And when government policies are supportive and really sort of nurturing and create incentives, you see tremendous business activity and potential. And you see that with things like financial reforms. So one of the big problems for productive entrepreneurs is lack of access to capital. There's a whole range of business activities that can and will need to be established. If in Iraq, of course, many have already been done. And I think one common mistake that people make is to assume that because there's a conflict or because there's political instability, business activity comes to a grinding halt. And that's actually not the case. We just see a different type of business activity.
Interesting. So our entrepreneurs that might be watching should not rule out conflict zones as potential opportunities.
No,
but they should realize they come with huge challenges.
They come with challenges, but also tremendous opportunity. But there are certain advantages to being in a conflict zone, and one of them is, and again, maybe this is to an extent region specific, but if you look at a place like Iraq, it is so strategically important, and it is so wealthy because of its oil revenues, that it's not going to go away in 5 years or 10 years. So, if you invest and you work in Iraq, you really have the opportunity to develop something with long-term potential. And that really can't be said for any place that you might just pick off a map, right? And then the other thing is, the risks include things like property rights, protection of contracts. If you are a firm that's registered in the United States and you're doing business in Nigeria, and there's a problem. Do you have a Nigerian-based entity that is treated under Nigerian law as the operating entity? Where are you subject to legal enforcement? What laws will you follow? Who will enforce your contracts? So there are big questions.
Absolutely.
Big questions.
Big questions.
And problems.
Big questions and problems.
But also big opportunity.
Big questions, big opportunities. Thank you so much for being here
Thank
today.
you.
I appreciate your time. Big questions, big opportunities may be the tagline for you to remember from today's Cyber Focus. Lots of opportunities out there, but go in with your eyes wide open and knowing what the different tools out there are actually measuring so that you're reading the research correctly. Thank you and have a great day.